It was supposed to be a quiet evening, a private martial arts gathering in a hidden dojo on the outskirts of Los Angeles. The kind of place only true insiders knew about. No media, no fans, no Hollywood drama. Just a room filled with some of the most respected martial artists in the world, invited to demonstrate techniques, exchange knowledge, and pay tribute to the old ways. Steven Seagal walked in like a storm in slow motion, tall, calm, and wrapped in that signature aura of unshakable confidence. The room seemed to shift around him. Some people straightened their posture. Others whispered as he passed, recognizing the aikido master from his countless action films. Seagal didn't acknowledge any of it. His expression stayed as still as a lake before dawn. Across the dojo, another presence entered quietly, almost unnoticed at first. Frank Dux. Where Seagal carried the weight of fame, Dux carried the weight of myth. The man whose stories inspired Bloodsport. The martial artist whispered about in underground circles, someone many had heard of, but few had ever truly seen fight. He wasn't flashy. He wasn't loud. He simply walked with the controlled power of someone who had survived battles most people only read about in books. When Seagal's eyes met Frank Dux'S, the air in the room changed. Seagal gave a small nod, the type a man gives when he recognizes strength in another. Dux returned it, calm, respectful, but fearless. The instructors hosting the event noticed the tension immediately. Not anger, not rivalry, something else. Curiosity. The kind that only happens when two legends who have carved their own paths finally stand in the same room, with nothing but open mats between them. As the evening went on, various masters demonstrated their techniques. People clapped, admired, learned. But every few minutes, someone's gaze drifted towards Seagal and Dux, both standing on opposite sides of the dojo like two mountains waiting for the right moment to shake the earth. Nobody said it out loud, but everyone felt it. Something special was about to happen. The energy inside the dojo shifted slowly, almost like a storm cloud drifting into a clear sky. Nobody could explain it, but everyone felt it. Whenever Steven Seagal and Frank Dux stood within 10 feet of each other, conversations softened, footsteps slowed, and every martial artist in the room found an excuse to glance their way. Two different worlds, two different philosophies, one legendary collision waiting to happen. Seagal watched one of the younger instructors demonstrate a wrist lock technique. The instructor moved fast, clean technique, crisp precision, the kind martial artists trained decades to perfect. When he finished, the room applauded respectfully. But Seagal didn't clap. He slowly raised one eyebrow and stepped forward. "That's one way to do it," he said, voice calm but carrying a weight that made several people straighten their backs. "But if you try that in a real fight, someone stronger will break your balance before you even set the lock." The younger instructor smiled politely, but everyone sensed the subtle sting. Seagal gestured, "Come at me." The instructor hesitated, realizing he was being asked to challenge a man known for ending confrontations in seconds. But he obeyed, lunging forward with a controlled strike. Seagal moved like water. One breath, one smooth motion. The instructor was on the mat, staring at the ceiling, wondering how he got there. The crowd murmured in awe. Even those who didn't like Seagal's attitude couldn't deny the efficiency of his technique. Powerful, fluid, unshakable. Across the room, Frank Dux simply watched with calm curiosity. He didn't react. He didn't comment. He simply observed. And that bothered Seagal more than he would admit. Another instructor approached Dux. "Sir, would you like to demonstrate a technique?" Dux smiled politely. "If the room wishes." Unlike Seagal, he didn't project dominance. He didn't impose himself. But when he stepped onto the mats, every whisper stopped. Dux invited 3 volunteers. 3. People exchanged glances. Was he serious? The volunteers stepped forward cautiously. Dux nodded once. What happened next was a blur. The first volunteer stepped in and instantly found himself swept sideways by a precise, effortless leg motion. He hit the mat softly, almost gracefully. The second came from behind. A shift of Dux'S elbow, a turn of his hips, and the man collapsed forward, gently guided to the ground. The third tried to grab. Dux flowed around him, applying just enough pressure to immobilize without harm. Not violent, not loud, just mastery. A different kind of power. The room fell into stunned silence. Steven Seagal narrowed his eyes. It wasn't the techniques that bothered him. It was how silently Dux performed them. How effortlessly he controlled the fight without the dramatic flair many martial artists rely on. He moved like someone who didn't need to prove anything. Seagal stepped forward. "Interesting," he said, voice deep. "But that won't work against someone who won't fall for tricks." Dux turned toward him, calm as still water. "They're not tricks," he replied. "Just principles." The crowd felt the temperature rise. One of the senior masters quickly stepped in, sensing the tension. "Gentlemen, maybe you two would like to share the mat? A friendly demonstration." Friendly. Nobody believed it for a second. But the word demonstration gave everyone an excuse to step back and form a circle around the mats. Phones stayed pocketed. This was a private event, and respect kept technology away. But every mind in the room memorized every moment. Seagal stood tall, strong, expression unchanged. Dux stood relaxed, breathing steady, hands loose at his sides. Two legends. Two styles. Two worlds. A student whispered, "Is this really happening?" Another replied, "Man, I've waited my whole life to see this." The senior master raised his hand. "Just a demonstration, nothing serious." Both men nodded, but the silence in the room said the truth. Neither of them was here just to demonstrate. This was a test, a silent challenge, a battle of philosophies. Before they stepped closer, before the first movement happened, the tension became unbearable. You could hear a pin drop. You could feel hearts pounding. You could see students on the edges of their feet, afraid to blink. Because for the first time ever, Steven Seagal and Frank Dux were about to face each other one-on-one. And while it wasn't officially a fight, the entire world would argue about this moment for decades. Just before the two legends moved, the narrator hook hits. White medium star engagement break. AAP Kiss Country or Kiss City SE Dek Rahi Ho? Or Bateo. The dojo had never been this silent. Steven Seagal and Frank Dux stood across from each other on the mat. Two legends separated by a few feet, yet the pressure between them felt heavy enough to bend the floorboards. No one dared move. No one even dared breathe too loudly. Every person in that dojo knew they were witnessing a once-in-a-lifetime moment. Not a movie scene, not a rumor, not an exaggerated story from the past. A real, raw confrontation between two giants. Seagal was the first to break the stillness. He adjusted the sleeves of his GI, rolled his massive shoulders, and took a slow breath through his nose. His expression didn't change, but something in his posture did. A slight tightening, a shift in his stance that told everyone he was preparing for more than a friendly demonstration. Frank Dux, on the other hand, simply relaxed his arms at his sides. No stance, no tension, no cinematic theatrics. His breathing stayed steady, rhythmic. He looked like a man standing in line at a grocery store, not a man facing off with one of Hollywood's most dominant martial artists. And that contrast only made the tension sharper. The headmaster stepped between them, raising a cautious hand. "Gentlemen, remember, this is a demonstration, not a match. Controlled movements only." Dux nodded respectfully. Seagal didn't nod. He just stared straight ahead, eyes unblinking. The master stepped back. The circle tightened. A few younger students whispered from the edges. "Yo, who do you think's got this?" "My money's on Seagal, bro. He's huge." "You serious?" Dux beat guys twice that size in real fights. "I'm shaking, man. This is insane." As the whispers died, Seagal finally spoke. His voice was deep, slow, and carried a subtle challenge beneath every syllable. "Let's show them what real martial arts looks like." The room stirred. That wasn't a statement. It was a dare. Frank Dux tilted his head slightly, his version of a polite shrug. Then let's keep it real, he said quietly. Something flashed in Seagal's eyes. Perhaps irritation. Perhaps respect. Perhaps both. The two men stepped closer. They now stood within arm's reach. Neither moved. Neither blinked. The intensity was suffocating. Finally, Seagal extended a hand. Not for a handshake, but to initiate contact, a traditional start for an aikido exchange. His palm hovered inches from Dux'S chest. This was it. The first touch. The first spark. The beginning of everything. Dux studied the hand for a fraction of a second and nodded. He placed his own hand lightly against Seagal's. Instantly, the room felt a subtle earthquake in the air. Dux felt Seagal's strength. Seagal felt Dux's balance. They both realized something at the exact same moment. This was no ordinary martial artist. Seagal made the first move. A sudden twist. Fast, sharp, clean, meant to off-balance Dux and flow into a wrist lock. It was a classic Seagal technique. Trap the joint, break the structure, control the opponent's center. But Dux didn't budge. Instead, with a soft pivot of his foot and a shift of his weight, he broke the angle before the lock even formed. Not violently, not aggressively, smoothly, like he'd rehearsed breaking this exact move 1,000 times in the dark. Seagal's eyes narrowed. The crowd gasped. He tried again, this time faster, combining a grip and shoulder manipulation. Again, Dux slipped out like smoke. Not fighting the force, redirecting it, neutralizing it. This time Seagal reset his stance. The room tensed. This wasn't a demonstration anymore. This was real. Seagal lowered his center of gravity, planted his feet, and launched a sudden forward movement, an aikido entry meant to slam Dux backward. But the moment Seagal's weight shifted forward, Dux's elbow came up, not striking, just intercepting. He redirected Seagal's momentum with the smallest shoulder turn imaginable. Seagal stumbled half a step, just half. But seeing Steven Seagal stumble, even slightly, was enough to send shockwaves through the crowd. A student whispered, "No way." Another murmured, "He just neutralized him." Seagal straightened, jaw tightening. Dux stayed relaxed. Still no stance. Still no tension. Just presence. Seagal exhaled slowly. "All right," he muttered under his breath. "Let's go deeper." Dux nodded once. "Your move." The challenge had officially been spoken. Not implied. Not hinted. Open. Direct. The audience leaned forward, eyes locked on the two men. Seagal rolled his neck, settled into a wider stance, and prepared a much more serious entry, one that real fighters used, not demonstration performers. Dux shifted slightly, almost imperceptibly. Everyone felt it. This was no longer a friendly demonstration. This was a test of mastery, a battle of philosophies, a silent clash of ego, experience, and raw skill. Just before the next move erupted, a voice whispered somewhere, "Are we really seeing this? Seagal versus Dux for real?" The answer was unfolding right in front of them. The hallway of the old dojo fell completely silent. Only the low hum of the fluorescent lights filled the space as Steven Seagal and Frank Dux stood facing each other, inches apart. What had begun as a casual conversation between martial artists had now spiraled into a confrontation no one expected. Students froze mid-stretch, instructors stood still, and the air felt thick, like the entire room was holding its breath. But something else was happening. A quiet ripple had started among the older practitioners in the back of the room. They were whispering among themselves, glancing at Frank Dux with widening eyes. One of them, a gray-bearded man with a black belt older than most people in the room, leaned forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "Is that Frank Dux?" Another nodded slowly. The Frank Dux, the man behind the Kumite legend. The whispers traveled quickly across the mats, around the walls, spreading like the start of a storm. Younger students struggled to place the name, but the veterans, their faces changed instantly. Some stepped back, some stepped forward, some simply stared at Steven Seagal, wondering if he understood who he had just challenged. Seagal didn't notice. Or maybe he didn't care. His arms were still crossed, jaw tight, eyes narrowed as he smirked at Frank like he had already won the encounter. "You really think you're something special, huh?" Seagal said in that slow, cold voice he was famous for. Frank didn't respond immediately. He simply stood there, calm, steady, grounded. Not defensive, not angry, just centered. A presence that filled the entire room without raising a single decibel. Seagal took Frank's silence as an invitation. "So tell me," he continued, shoulders shifting aggressively, "are the stories real? Or are you just another guy who talks big but can't back it up?" The crowd leaned in. Some students swallowed hard. A few others pulled out their phones, careful, discreet, documenting what felt like a historic moment. Everyone sensed something huge was about to unfold. Frank finally spoke, his voice low but sharp as a blade. "I don't talk big," he said. "I let my actions speak." It wasn't loud, but it carried across the entire dojo like thunder. The whispers grew louder. "That's him. That's really him. The man who inspired Bloodsport. The fighter who broke world records." Even those who hadn't originally recognized him were now staring at Frank with newfound respect and a bit of fear. Seagal's expression flickered, only for a second, but it was enough. A crack in the facade. A moment of uncertainty. He quickly masked it with arrogance. "Oh, please," he scoffed. "You think your little secret tournament makes you a real fighter? I've trained killers, military teams, CIA operatives. I've been doing this long before you were telling stories to Hollywood." Frank didn't flinch. Instead, he slowly stepped forward, not aggressively, not provocatively, but with the confidence of a man who knew exactly who he was and didn't need validation. "Steven," Frank said quietly, "you don't know me. Not really. You've heard rumors. You've heard opinions. But you've never stood across from me." The room tensed. Seagal raised his chin. "And maybe now I will." The dojo gasped. But before anything else could happen, the gray-bearded black belt stepped forward. He bowed deeply toward Frank, shocking everyone, including Seagal. "It is an honor to meet the champion of the Kumite," he said. "Your legacy inspired thousands of us. You are a legend." Frank respectfully returned the bow. As the two men rose, the entire room shifted. Students began adjusting their posture. Instructors nodded respectfully. Even the younger ones who didn't grow up on Frank's story felt the room's energy transform. Steven Seagal noticed. His smirk wavered again. The crowd wasn't rallying behind him. They were shifting toward Frank. And that was something Seagal wasn't used to. He took a half step back, subtle, almost unnoticeable, but Frank saw it. Everyone did. Still, Frank remained humble. He didn't gloat, didn't posture, didn't take advantage. He simply spoke softly, but with the kind of power that comes from truth, not ego. "I didn't come here to prove anything. The air inside the dojo felt heavier than before. Everyone sensed it. This wasn't just a disagreement anymore. This was ego versus experience. A Hollywood tough guy versus a real underground legend. Steven Seagal shifted his weight, trying to regain control of the moment. The whispers about Frank's identity still echoed from wall to wall, and Seagal hated every second of it. He straightened his posture, squared his shoulders, and spoke louder than before, trying to drown out the murmurs. "Let's get something straight," Seagal barked. "This is my space. My dojo today. My training session. And I don't let unverified legends waltz in and pretend they're somebody." A couple of students exchanged nervous glances. Seagal wasn't just challenging Frank's presence. He was attacking his entire legacy. Frank's jaw tightened slightly, but he stayed calm. "I didn't pretend anything," Frank replied. "I was invited to train, not to compete with you." Seagal scoffed and stepped closer, close enough that only inches separated them. "No," Seagal growled. "You came here to show off. To get attention. To see if you could stand next to me and be somebody." Frank didn't move, didn't blink, didn't even shift his breathing. Instead, He looked Seagal directly in the eyes and spoke in a tone so steady it felt like a punch wrapped in silk. I was somebody before you ever heard my name. The crowd murmured loudly. Some gasped. Some stepped back out of instinct. Seagal's face reddened. His ego couldn't take being challenged publicly, especially not by someone the room was now quietly admiring. He jabbed a finger toward Frank's chest. You think you're better than me? Frank gently brushed Seagal's finger away, not aggressively, but firmly enough to show he wouldn't tolerate disrespect. I think, Frank said slowly, that martial arts is about discipline, respect, and humility. But what I see right now isn't that. The room froze. Even the phones recording the confrontation shook slightly. The students holding them were trembling, not from fear, but from the intensity radiating between the two men. Seagal's breathing grew heavier. Don't lecture me about martial arts, he snarled. I've trained with the best. I've been recognized by masters around the world. Frank nodded respectfully. So have I, he replied. But real masters don't brag about it. Seagal lunged forward, not with a punch, but a shove, a challenge, a dare. The type of physical provocation meant to either intimidate someone or start a fight. A couple of students gasped. The instructors tensed. Somebody whispered, "Oh no." But Frank didn't stumble, didn't react, didn't rise to the bait. He simply took one slow breath, then spoke with a command so powerful that the entire dojo fell silent as if he had slammed a gong. Steven, I don't fight to prove I can win. I fight to protect. And right now, you are asking me to cross a line I don't cross anymore. Seagal laughed mockingly. A line you don't cross? Sounds like you're scared. Frank stepped forward, only half an inch. But that half inch felt like a tidal wave of pressure crashing over the room. I've faced things you wouldn't believe, Frank said quietly. But fear isn't the reason I'm standing still. Discipline is. The crowd stared in awe. Frank continued. Anyone can throw a punch. A child can hurt someone. But controlling your power, that is martial arts. That is strength. His voice grew deeper, almost resonant. I won't fight you because you want to feed your ego. I won't harm you to prove anything to this room. I don't need to. Seagal clenched his fists, but something in Frank's tone, something in his eyes, something in his absolute steadiness, made him hesitate. Frank turned slightly so the entire dojo could hear. This, he gestured to Seagal's stance, is not the path. Martial arts was never meant to be a tool for intimidation. It's a tool for growth, for character, for respect. People nodded slowly. The gray-bearded black belt lowered his gaze respectfully. Even some of Seagal's own students looked conflicted. It was clear who was speaking from wisdom and who was speaking from ego. Seagal felt the crowd slipping away from him again. In desperation, he raised his voice. Then if you won't fight, admit it. Admit I'm the better martial artist. Frank turned back toward him, and for the first time that day, his expression hardened. I will admit nothing, Frank said. But I will say this. If you need the world to worship you, then you haven't learned the first lesson of martial arts. Seagal swallowed hard. And what lesson is that? He muttered, almost whispering. Frank's answer hit like thunder. Respect is earned, not demanded. The dojo erupted, not with cheers, but with silence. The dojo had gone silent in a way that made every heartbeat loud. Steven Seagal's chest rose and fell rapidly as he tried to regain control of the room. But the momentum had already shifted. Every eye was now on Frank Dux, not on Seagal, not on the instructors, not on the younger students. Frank Dux, standing calm and composed, radiated a presence that couldn't be ignored. Somewhere in the back, a gray-bearded black belt who had been quietly observing for years whispered to the nearest student. That's Frank Dux, the man behind the Kumite, the one who fought legends and won. The real Bloodsport champion. The words spread instantly. Whispers turned into audible murmurs. Gasps, soft but widespread, filled the room. Every student's phone, once hesitant, now discreetly came out to capture the moment. The dojo was alive, But the excitement wasn't from a flashy stunt. It was from history being witnessed firsthand. Seagal's smirk faltered. He straightened, clenched his fists, and scanned the room. He could feel the subtle shift, the energy, the respect, the admiration, all tilting away from him and toward Frank. "Wait," a young instructor whispered loudly, pointing at Frank. Is that really him?" The realization rippled through the crowd. Eyes widened. Some jaws dropped. Others whispered frantic questions to friends. Students who had never trained with Frank before felt a rush of awe. Those who had studied martial arts legends felt chills. And in that instant, the room acknowledged a simple truth. Frank Dux was no myth. Frank, however, remained calm. He did not raise his voice, did not gloat, and did not take a single step toward Seagal. Instead, he lowered his gaze respectfully, nodded toward the instructors, and said, "I'm honored to be here." The room, sensing the humility in his presence, erupted in quiet applause, soft claps, nods, murmurs of respect. Not a celebration of victory, but a recognition of mastery. Seagal's jaw tightened. His ego demanded some sort of response, but he found himself struggling for words. The public, the students, the room, they all knew who Frank Dux was. He was a legend. He was untouchable in that moment, not because he had fought anyone physically in this room yet, but because of the sheer respect he commanded. A senior instructor finally spoke, breaking the tension. "Everyone, please, this is a rare opportunity to witness greatness. Let's remember why we're here." But the crowd had already made up its mind. They were no longer focused on Seagal's height, fame, or Hollywood bravado. They were focused on the quiet power, humility, and control of the man in front of them. Seagal shifted uncomfortably. He had expected deference from the crowd, or at least neutral acknowledgement. Instead, he was seeing admiration directed at Frank. And Frank hadn't done anything yet. No strikes, no overpowering moves. Just his presence, his discipline, and his aura of mastery. At that moment, one of the younger students finally called out, voice shaking with excitement. "Everyone, that's Frank Dux, the real Bloodsport champion. He's the one the stories are about." The entire room erupted in astonishment. Phones were raised. The whispering turned into exclamations. Some people were shaking their heads in disbelief. Others laughed softly, half in awe, half in excitement. Frank stepped forward slightly, not to dominate, but to acknowledge the moment. He spoke calmly, but every word carried weight. Martial arts is not about fame. It's not about proving you're better than someone else. It's about respect for your opponent, for yourself, and for the art itself. This is what I stand for. Even Seagal, for the first time that day, paused. The smirk had vanished entirely. He realized that no matter what happened in the next few minutes, the room already knew the truth. Frank Dux's mastery was beyond challenge, beyond ego, beyond reputation. The crowd erupted in cheers, not loud or chaotic, but steady, reverent applause that filled the dojo. Everyone wanted to honor Frank, not because he had defeated Seagal, but because he had demonstrated what it meant to be a true martial artist. At this moment, the atmosphere shifted completely. Seagal, sensing the tide of respect had turned against him, stepped back, adjusting his stance defensively. The energy in the dojo was no longer about confrontation. It was about recognition, about humility, about respect. Frank, still composed, looked around the room and smiled gently. He did not gloat. He did not taunt. He simply allowed the moment to speak for itself. The students cheered, the instructors nodded, and the whispers turned into stories that would be repeated for years to come. White medium star engagement break. Kia AP chat the key Frank Pelly high apnea identity reveal cardita? Yes, no comment karka bateo. Or bateo count si city. The dojo had returned to normal, or as normal as it could be after what had just happened. But outside its walls, the world was just beginning to catch up. Videos of the encounter, discreetly recorded by students on their phones, started circulating online. Within hours, clips of Steven Seagal facing Frank Dux went viral across martial arts forums, YouTube channels, and social media platforms worldwide. Every comment section was flooded with disbelief, admiration, and debate. Some people argued about who would have won in a full fight. Others marveled at Frank Dux's calm, disciplined demeanor, praising his humility in the face of a provocative Seagal. But the overarching sentiment was unanimous. This was not just a clash of two martial artists. It was a lesson in mastery, respect, and self-control. In the dojo, the atmosphere was calmer now. Seagal, who had been tense and defensive just hours before, sat quietly with a group of students, reflecting. There was no gloating, no dramatic outburst, just a quiet acknowledgement that the day had been a turning point. Meanwhile, Frank Dux remained composed, helping a few younger students refine techniques, giving pointers, and quietly reminding them that martial arts was about character, not ego. The viral videos spread across continents. In Tokyo, seasoned martial artists discussed the encounter with reverence. In Los Angeles, fans debated every subtle movement Frank had made. In Manila, people shared clips in awe, proud to see a legend like Frank still teaching the true values of martial arts. Even mainstream media picked up the story. Martial arts legends face off in epic dojo encounter. Headlines read, with thousands of comments praising the discipline and humility of both men, but especially Frank Dux. Online debates raged about the techniques displayed, the philosophies demonstrated, and the power of restraint. But one common thread ran through all discussions. No one could deny the respect Frank commanded. He didn't have to strike, shout, or dominate. The viral footage spoke volumes. His poise, discipline, and integrity left an indelible mark on every viewer. Seagal, though experienced and famous, realized something important in those days after the incident. Respect could not be demanded, only earned. And a quiet, disciplined legend like Frank Dux could command it without lifting a hand to prove dominance. Meanwhile, Frank Dux's message spread beyond martial arts circles. Across social media, people shared clips and quotes emphasizing respect, humility, and restraint. His calm demeanor became a viral lesson. True mastery is silent, but its impact is thunderous. People were inspired not only by the martial arts, but by the moral lessons embedded in the encounter. In private interviews, Frank said, "I didn't come to fight anyone. I came to teach. Martial arts is not about proving superiority. It's about respect for your opponent, for yourself, and for the art itself." That is the lesson I hope people take away from this encounter. Seagal, in subsequent interviews, acknowledged the same lesson. Though reluctant at first, he admitted the event had forced him to reflect on ego, humility, and what it truly means to be a martial artist. The encounter became legendary, not because anyone won a fight, but because it reminded the world of values often overlooked: respect, humility, discipline, and the power of quiet mastery. White Medium Star final call to action. If you believe true respect is earned, not demanded, type honor in the comments. Share this story with someone who needs to see the power of humility and discipline, and follow for more epic legends and inspiring stories. Even months later, martial